All right. Welcome, everybody. We are just going to hang for a minute or two while we are waiting for folks to join. We're going to have Andrew Miller with us today to talk all things Bibi, Trump meeting, Israel security assistance, and just general U.S.-Israel relationship. Jeremy is off traveling this week, so you just got me and our guest. No blue shirts this week. We got white shirts, pink shirts. Andrew, where'd you get? Why are you wearing a pink shirt? I think you need to tell people.
My daughter's favorite color, so I bought the shirt to give her the pleasure of having Daddy wear pink in the morning when I drop her off at school.
Nice. That's as we were talking about before. We should always let daughters dress dads. I think it ends up like being much better.
Definitely has better taste than I do, and she's only 4.
All right. Well, why don't we get rolling, everyone? Welcome to Word on the Street. I'm Elon Goldenberg, Chief Policy Officer at J Street. Jeremy Ben-Ami, my counterpart and partner, is off traveling this week. So we've talked about this before. Like, we sometimes say that, Jeremy's the hack, I'm the wonk. And when Jeremy disappears, like, we just wonk it up altogether. So that's what we're doing this week with a former colleague of mine, Andrew Miller. Andrew is a senior fellow in national security and international policy at Center for American Progress. He was also a deputy assistant secretary of state for Israeli-Palestinian affairs in the Biden administration at the State Department. So really, in English, that means the guy who was the most senior person solely responsible for this issue at the State Department. And did that especially during, that first year of the war. We were working together after October 7th, but also before. And Andrew also in the Obama administration was the National Security Council. He was director for Egypt and Israel and did a lot on U.S.-Israel MOU, security assistance, things like that. So Andrew, welcome to Word on the Street. Before we start, something we always do at Word on the Street these days is 2 reminders for our viewers. One, always feel free to hit the like button. We need to ups us on the algorithms. And the second is just a reminder that we will have our convention just a few weeks from now, J Street's National Convention, coming February 28th to March 3rd. Andrew will be there. I will be there. Pretty much everybody you see on the show ends up getting there eventually. This is going to be really fun, really rewarding, I think, and just a wonderful opportunity to be together with other people in very hard times, very important times, in community together, organizing, for a democracy, for a pro-Israel, pro-peace agenda as we head into 2026. So with that, Andrew, welcome. Let's start with news of the day. Netanyahu-Trump meeting just wrapped up. Not much news coming out of it so far, but interested to get your take.
Well, thanks for having me, Elon. It's always good to be on programs with friends, as opposed to acquaintances or even adversaries. Although sometimes they're necessary. The Bibi visit to Washington. Obviously, the backstory is important. That he was originally going to come next week for the Board of Peace meeting, and then he moved up the trip a week. He said he's still coming next week potentially, or at least he's still speaking at the APAC summit, which is the same week as the Board of Peace meeting. But I would be surprised if he actually does appear at the Board of Peace meeting. So there is some tension over that, with Netanyahu getting some pressure back home over his agreement to participate, although he hasn't, to my understanding, signed the Board of Peace charter as of yet. So as usual, he's doing the classic Bibi, trying to manage Trump, but not actually execute his commitment to the president. It's being framed as focused on Iran, and certainly that, I'm sure that was the discussion. Netanyahu said he was going to deliver intelligence on the threat that Iran poses. There is clearly some Israeli concern that Trump may taco. He may chicken out on this one and not follow through with serious strikes on the Iranians. Israel previously had discouraged Trump from striking during the protests, but that was because the defensive pieces weren't set and Israel could have been exposed. And the understanding was that Netanyahu and others weren't happy with the magnitude of the strikes that the Trump administration was considering. The juice wasn't worth the squeeze. It does appear now that what the U.S. is internally considering is a much more substantial strike. Although it's quite ambiguous given the shifting objectives. And then obviously there's Gaza, and we've heard in the last few days that the IDF is putting together plans for another operation to disarm Hamas if there isn't progress, although we'll have to determine whether that's just a warning rather than an intent to intervene. So all of this is taking place. There are so many moving parts. It's part of this orchestra that Netanyahu is running.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of different pieces there, so I'm going to try to take them kind of one piece at a time. And let's start with Iran, and at least I'll give you my take on this. It does feel like, as you said, right, you had these protests that were real and significant and important. Trump comes out and fires away with very public statements about supporting them and intervening militarily, which gets a lot of people out into the streets. The Iranian regime then horrifically cracks down on these with really what was probably the most grotesque action. That for a really bad regime, this seems like the worst thing that they have done in the history of the Islamic Republic. I mean, the low end of the spectrum is an estimate of 5,000 killed. I think the high end is probably around 15 or 20. Nobody really knows exactly. And so you have all of that happening. And then Trump, after bloviating on all the threats, turns to actually strike and realizes, A, did not check with the military and did not actually have the theater set to be able to do things effectively. B, all of the regional partners are freaked out because the U.S. is not ready to defend them in the way they're postured, which kind of goes to show you what happens when you fire your mouth out first and don't actually have a plan. And so now we're fast forward a month, and here we are. We're putting the military pieces in place, talking about a negotiation. Trump did say coming out of this meeting, negotiations are going to continue, and so I don't know how Netanyahu reacts to that. Andrew, you and I were also talking about the fact that there's been no, usually you have a big press conference that comes after these meetings. Now, Trump hasn't been doing as many press conferences after foreign leader meetings, but at the same time, this is the big gift to Netanyahu. This is what he comes to Washington for. He comes to Washington to stand next to Trump like he did in December and gets this love fest from Trump and this huge hug. So I don't know what you make of the fact that he's not getting any of that other than a couple of terse readouts so far. Maybe we'll get more reporting.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the absence of the any type of public component, at least so far, it could be attributable one, to the fact that it does appear that Netanyahu is not going to be part of the Board of Peace, and that's something Trump would want Netanyahu to be there to confirm this structure that's important to Trump, at least symbolically. Netanyahu not joining that is going to be an irritant. Also, as I just saw the email that you sent out, Alon, on the West Bank, the very, very concerning changes to Israeli policy and Israeli law in the West Bank. If you do a public event at the White House and you open it up to questions, almost certainly it's going to lead to a journalist asking about that. And that would be difficult for both Netanyahu and Trump to handle. So even if you were to try to do a bear hug, you were to shower Bibi with accolades, that would put both of them in an awkward position where Bibi would have to decide, do I lean into this position, which he believes is obviously ideologically important and he supports, but is also important to his coalition and to the elections, at the risk of irritating Trump. And from Trump's perspective, does he just say, "Look, we have disagreements, but he's not going to do it," which doesn't help Bibi either. It's a no-win situation. So they may have concluded, or Trump may have concluded, that it wasn't worth giving Bibi that gift, or it was even if he wanted to give Bibi that gift, he wouldn't be able to give him an unalloyed victory because there were these issues there. But with the military dimension, it's somewhat interesting that the focus is on the nukes right now because, of all of the threats that exist at this moment, the nukes are arguably the farthest away, where, there still is the threat. You have over 900 pounds of HEU presumably buried somewhere within Iran. That puts Iran closer to a nuclear weapon than anyone should be comfortable with. And a negotiated agreement that would deal with those would obviously be beneficial, but that doesn't pose an immediate threat to U.S. security, to regional security. And I'm not even sure that Netanyahu is primarily concerned with that. It appears the Israelis are more concerned with the ballistic missiles, and also with the prospect of, well, maybe we could get regime change if the United States struck hard enough. And it's unclear whether Trump is prepared to push for regime change. But as we know, it's not easy to decapitate a regime from the air. You can take out a leader, but if you have an actual regime structure that's deeper than a single individual, a single assassination or a single elimination of an individual is not going to topple them. It's going to require a more sustained campaign. And so will the ballistic missiles. And so it's not actually that different from the situation last summer during the 12-day war, where Israel had taken things about as far as they could unilaterally, but they weren't able to deal with Fordo by themselves. Israel is not in the position where they can deal with the ballistic missile program without U.S. help, because it's sufficiently protected, because it's dispersed around the country. The type of sustained military strikes against IRGC, command and control, that would be required to disrupt the regime's functionality to the point that protesters, that opposition could actually topple the regime, that's much more in the U.S. capacity than it is in the Israeli capacity. So Bibi's once more going to the till and asking Trump to do this for them. So, again, Trump isn't necessarily opposed to it, but he's also willing to settle for something that would be important from an international perspective, but wouldn't address Bibi's concerns, wouldn't address Israeli concerns in a real sense.
Yeah, and I think that makes sense. The last thing I'll say about this, and especially on Iran, is we were told in June that this was all done, that this was all over, and yet here we are 9 months later, Trump negotiating over a nuclear program that supposedly doesn't exist anymore, and the Israelis concerned about another exchange in the region. And this is the new normal we're living in ever since we had this war. But at the time, I thought we solved it all.
It's important to acknowledge too that, as you mentioned, the extent of the repression, the atrocities committed by the Iranian regime, a fair number of those Iranians, their deaths are at least partly attributable to President Trump's irresponsible rhetoric. Regardless of whether you think President Trump should have become involved militarily, his intimation that he was going to help the Iranians, that he was going to intervene to protect them. I mean, I know from conversations with many Iranian American friends with family back in Tehran that that's what caused them to turn out, that they thought this would be different because the US would be there for them. So in a very real sense, Trump led some of these poor Iranian people who were protesting for their most basic rights to their death. And that shouldn't be lost in all of this. It was incredibly cruel and callous. And regardless of what happens subsequently, we shouldn't forget that those lives have been lost as a result of the president's actions.
Yeah, and people totally underestimate that. It reminds me, I think back to the Green Movement and 2009 when Obama got so much criticism, and maybe he could have been more publicly supportive. This is an example of this is what happens when you go too far in the other direction. If you're not willing to back it up and you haven't thought it all through, and then you just end up with a bunch of people. There's other examples of this in history, whether it's supporting the Kurds against Saddam and then walking away from them in 1991 or otherwise. You got to really think through if you're the U.S. president, what it is you're going to say and how you're going to follow through in your threats, because the world is watching you, and Trump sometimes just does not. But Andrew, you started to get to something else that we should move on and talk about, which is these announcements, right? Right before Bibi left town, right before he came to the U.S., the Israeli cabinet basically moved ahead with a couple of very important decisions that essentially give first the Israeli government a lot more authority in areas A and B, areas that have long been Palestinian cities, long controlled by Palestinian authority, basically since the start of Oslo or since 1995, Oslo II. Now, for the first time, giving the Israeli government authority to go into those areas and potentially demolish homes, take over territory. And the other, just creating a much more loose environment by removing regulations around settlers buying territory in the West Bank and being able to buy Palestinian territory, which has historically led to, stealing, coercion, falsification, fraud, to basically do whatever you need to do to take land. Certainly under this government. So, how are you seeing the decision there, and what do you think the implications are?
I mean, I think would be dangerous to underestimate how significant it is. And it's certainly a part of the broader trend and the broader actions that have been pursued under this Netanyahu government and have been spearheaded by Smotrich, who has been extraordinarily and disastrously effective at implementing his agenda to cement Israel's control over the West Bank. But this takes it to a new level. As you noted, with the ability of Israelis, of Israeli settlers to directly purchase land from Palestinians, that obviously creates opportunities for coercion, for fraud. But even in those cases where it's a legitimate transaction, we both know from our government service that part of our ability to head off some very troubling settlements was the prolonged process of licensing, where you had to go through multiple stages, approval of projects. That has effectively been eliminated. With at least in these areas, by this change of policy, where it's up to an individual or to two individuals to agree to a transaction, and then you have another fact on the ground. It's not a 3 or 4 year process that has to be managed through the bureaucracy, where there are multiple places for the United States or the international community to intervene to try to stop it from happening. It's also deeply concerning that it, in effect, contravenes the Oslo Accords, which, for all of its frailties and failures, nevertheless provided some type of protection, some type of institutional structure for the Palestinian Authority to operate. It's arrogating to the Israeli government more authority in areas A and B. And what particularly concerns me are in Hebron and Bethlehem, the decisions to transfer authority from the Palestinian municipalities directly to the Israeli military. And in Hebron, we've been, both been there. We know what it's like in those environments. That's a powder keg; it could go off at any time. the mention of some type of seminary in Bethlehem, which would be new to have some type of Jewish learning establishment in Bethlehem. We've seen this before. We've seen this movie where the first thing that happens is some type of Jewish place of worship is established, and that ultimately leads to places of residence. And Bethlehem has largely been free of settlements, at least Bethlehem proper, the city. If this, is the beginning of a process of settlements within Bethlehem itself, I mean, the impact that would have on territorial contiguity, even if you were able to freeze all of these other threats as E1 proceeds, as these other projects continue. If Bethlehem is penetrated, if that becomes Swiss cheese, there is no Palestinian state that is possible. But this is the agenda of the Netanyahu government. This is not a theory. This is not a conclusion that we've reached. This is what Smotrich says. This is what the defense minister from Netanyahu's own party says. This is what Netanyahu has said time and again. And it may not be a coincidence that Smotrich is struggling to get to clear the threshold in elections to get back into the Knesset, which Bibi would need to have really any chance of forming a coalition and retaining the premiership once elections do happen. But if you think that this is just election politics and Netanyahu isn't actually committed to this agenda of greater Israel, you're deluding yourself. This is what Netanyahu wants, and those who support Netanyahu are empowering a vision of Israel that is unsustainable and that is antagonistic to Palestinian rights.
And it's such a slap in the face to Trump, frankly, right? For him to do this right before getting on a plane and coming to Washington to meet with Trump. Trump's got this whole agenda on Gaza. Trump wants to get through his 20-point plan, which, look, J Street has supported significant elements of it. I think we've been very clear that we have real problems with this crazy Board of Peace idea and some of the insane ways he's putting it together. But in terms of things like security forces and an interim Palestinian government and some of those things they're working on, we support that. But let's be clear. These steps in the West Bank entirely undermine all of that. And, I think maybe it's one of the reasons why we're getting silence today in a very quiet meeting, as you said, is not wanting to reward some of this. And I do think there's also just a reminder that Israel has this historic opportunity right now. The Arab states, the Gulf states, Syria, Lebanon, even, there are opportunities to really deepen cooperation to get to what we call the 23-state solution.
Yes.
But none of that can happen when, and by the way, that's also what Donald Trump wants, because he wants his Nobel Peace Prize. And if he were able to pull all that off and he got the Nobel Peace Prize for it, that's fine with me. But instead, here's Netanyahu essentially giving him the middle finger and just going with Smotrich and Ben-Gvir right before he gets on a plane and doing this. And it's really important, I think, for Trump to actually be out there and call this out. Maybe try to call out Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, but I don't think that's going to happen, unfortunately. At least what we didn't get was a repeat of the love fest between Bibi and Trump and the real public love fest we saw in December.
Yes. And the calls for pardoning Netanyahu, intervening in the Israeli judicial system in a way that's flagrantly inappropriate. If Israelis were to intervene in the U.S. Judicial process, there would certainly be a backlash to it. But to your point, Alon, it's an incredibly sensitive moment, and we've seen that the willingness of Arab countries to support President Trump's vision in Gaza, despite their desire to please President Trump, has been hindered by the absence of progress on the Palestinian issue, the absence of anything approaching a true pathway to a Palestinian state. There's an allusion to a pathway, but there's nothing concrete in that regard. And even the Emiratis, who are the most forward-leaning, are saying we will fund humanitarian assistance, but we're not taking over the government. And that's not, as Trump would say, that's false news. There's only so much we're willing to go under these circumstances. And it is noteworthy that although the Saudis joined the Board of Peace, Mohammed bin Salman was not appearing at Davos with Trump. And this is someone who does everything possible to appeal to Trump. There are limits in the Arab world, so that opportunity coexists with this threat. And instead of seeking to eliminate the threat and lean into this opportunity, Netanyahu seems determined to turn Israel into a pariah state, and to not only push off its greatest ally, but to forego this unprecedented opportunity to build true regional integration. It's strategic madness, and it is entirely self-serving.
So I'm going to just make one final disclaimer, and then we're going to move on to a different session, which is also just to say there's also a world where Andrew and I are totally wrong, and they were just doing this quiet pretend thing for different cover. And tomorrow we wake up to American strikes on Iran, and that's also totally conceivable. So
Yes.
just going to hold that out there. I don't think that's what's happening tomorrow, but we should so. So we're about halfway through the episode. I just want to remind those of you who have joined us. One, this is Word on the Street. I'm Elon Goldenberg. I'm Chief Policy Officer at J Street. With this week, we're interviewing Andrew Miller. Jeremy is on travel. And just a reminder for all of you that our convention is coming up February 28th to March 3rd. Use the code word WTS, Word on the Street. If you sign up, you get a discount. And so please go ahead and sign up for our convention. And the other thing, also, just as we'll keep telling you, if you're enjoying what you're listening to, hit that like button, hit that restack button. It helps get our information out. Andrew, I want to pivot to a broader conversation. You and I have had some conversations and discussions about this. You wrote for Foreign Affairs last month an article called "The End of the Israel Exception." And, we've had both Dan Shapiro and Ben Rhodes on the show recently talking about different perspectives of where the U.S.-Israel relationship needs to go. I tell people I kind of find your argument, which is not exactly either of theirs, to be the one that makes the most sense to me. I think this is a really important piece for people to read. I encourage everyone to go read Andrew's piece. I think this is the way that the U.S.-Israel relationship, this is where it needs to go. This is actually very much the intellectual framework we need to be thinking about. And certainly one of the ones we're thinking about here at J Street. But rather than telling people what it is, I'm just going to hand it over to you to talk about it. Only want to say it's such an important piece that I want people to really read it.
No, thanks for those kind words, Alon. I really do appreciate it. It means a lot coming from you. The premise of the article is that the U.S.-Israel relationship, certainly for the last 30 plus years, has been exceptional. It's been conducted on terms unlike any other U.S. bilateral relationship. And the intent behind that was to support a special relationship with Israel, to help Israel, to ensure that Israel had the support, diplomatic, financial, military it needed to take risks for peace. But instead of incentivizing, instead of making Israel feel comfortable to pursue peace, it had the opposite effect. It actually created what I call a moral hazard, borrowing from economics. It incentivized Israeli leaders to pursue reckless policies, to pursue maximalist territorial objectives, knowing that the United States was going to support them, even when Israel was engaging in actions that were contrary to U.S. law or contrary to international law. And that's a standard that has not been applied consistently to any other country. Yes, you can find moments where the United States has given a pass to one country or another for a short period of time, but never for such an extended period of time, literally decades. And my view of that is it's bad policy. It has not succeeded in making Israel more secure. It has not promoted peace. It has not promoted the rights of Palestinians and a two-state solution. I think it's morally wrong in that there should be an equality as the basis for our dealings with all countries. And I also think that it's politically mistaken in its approach, in that the exceptional relationships, the relationships that don't look like the others, tend to attract more attention for good and for bad. And in many respects, that puts a target on you. So the fact that Israel does receive so much assistance, regardless of how one feels about that, and it receives it on terms that are more unhindered or less restricted than other countries, that creates higher expectations. So when people ask, why are we more critical of Israel in this context than we are of Saudi Arabia? Well, it's not U.S. fund, it's not U.S. taxpayer money that is funding the equipment the Saudis are using. That doesn't mean we shouldn't criticize the Saudis and use our influence to change their behavior, but it intensifies the expectations, and it implicates the United States and individual Americans of what's being done. So what my article calls for is de-exceptionalizing the relationship, normalizing the relationship, kind of a play on words. Instead of normalizing Israel regionally, which also needs to be done, normalizing the bilateral relationship so that the US-Israel relationship is conducted on the same terms as any other relationship, that it is defined by clear objectives and interest to which both sides are held accountable, so that US law is followed in all instances. There is an effort to try to ensure that what's being done is not against the law of the land. To use conditionality. If there is deviation from those understandings, then there should be some type of withholding, whether it's of assistance or of diplomatic support, or it could be an incentive. Conditionality cuts both ways. You could provide a positive incentive, inducement, to move in a different direction. And there also needs to be an appreciation for there needs to be an appreciation for protecting each other's domestic politics and not intervening in them, just as a matter of respect. That doesn't mean you shouldn't be free to express your views to the American people or to the Israeli people. It's just that you do not get involved in working with one party against another party. That's a basis of sovereignty. That's how friends deal with each other. And my thesis is that if we can move in that direction, if we can have a relationship on those terms, it's ultimately going to be better in the long term for the US-Israel relationship. It's going to be a stronger relationship. Now, depending on how Israel reacts to it, it could lead to more friction. It could lead to more distance in the relationship. But if Israel responds in a favorable way, it could actually lead to this special type of relationship that many Americans and many Israelis do want. It could lead to a special relationship as we do with the United Kingdom, which is truly strategic in the sense that we don't have to worry about taking a measure in support of our ally, because we know that we have shared objectives. And we know that when we come to ask them for help, they're going to stand with us. That is the nature, that pay it forward mentality is what defines an alliance versus just a partnership or a transactional relationship. So that's my roadmap to creating a better relationship that is more sustainable politically with the American public, but also allows us to advance U.S. objectives, which I genuinely believe are in the Israeli people's interest, of a two-state solution, of having a secure regional environment, of being accepted globally, of Israel being a normal country, which is what I think most Israelis want more than anything else.
Yeah, and I think for me, the part that really makes it a couple of things stick out to me. One is just treating Israel like a normal country, which, by the way, doesn't mean walking away from Israel, right? Like, we have a lot of interest, and that was one of the things that's so important in your article. We do have a lot of things that align with the Israelis. We have a lot of joint interests on Iran, even if we have common objectives. Sometimes we have disagreements about the nature of the threat or a particular strategy. We have a lot of agreement. We cooperate on technology. We cooperate on the economy. We do a lot of intelligence sharing. All these things are positive things that, security assistance that you can work on together. When you agree on things, you work together. That's how it works with friends in normal countries. When you disagree on things, you don't have to fight it out all the time, but you also don't have to back each other up. You can agree to go your different ways on things, and that is healthy and normal. So I really appreciated, that particular description, as well as the argument that, man, we need to get out of each other's politics, given how deeply that has really, especially in the last 10 years, they'll admit, Bill Clinton did a fair dose of that to
Yes,
Bibi, like, early on, and I think set some of the
absolutely.
conditions. And your article, you actually make the case, no, look, we got to do this on both sides and get out of each other's domestic politics. I do wonder, you think this argument also gets some resonance on the right at this point when you see the Heritage Foundation making the case for winding down security assistance, or Bibi himself and Lindsey Graham talking about maybe like putting the security assistance relationship on more normal footing?
I think it could get some more resonance on the right, and in that sense, it could potentially form a new consensus, a bipartisan consensus. It's not going to be the entirety of the Democratic Party. It's not going to be the entirety of the Republican Party. We know that there's polarization across the spectrum and within each party, but it could get a substantial percentage of the American people across the board and bring them together. And in that sense, restore a degree of bipartisanship to this relationship that has been the casualty of the past couple decades, where the blatant politicizing of the relationship, and this is more Netanyahu, this is more Dermer than anyone else in really identifying Israel with the Republicans, and it would be equally wrong to identify Israel with the Democrats. And I can say that as a Democrat, it shouldn't be with a single party, but it would be the solution to that problem. It would provide a basis for forging a relationship that wouldn't be subject to the whims of who is in the White House at any given point in time, or who's in who happens to be in the prime minister's residence. Um, I think there is resonance on the right in the sense that among those who are pushing for taking a new look at security assistance, at taking a different posture vis-a-vis Israel. There, in many senses, they're more traditional Republicans who, in domestic issues, would say you have to earn it. It's America is a land of opportunity, but you need to do what you have to put in the effort. And once you've earned someone's respect, then you should be treated. And whether that's a fair characterization or not, I think they would apply that to the U.S.-Israel relationship and say, if both sides treat each other on equal terms and on terms that are equal with other countries, and they fulfill those obligations, then they're going to be more comfortable with the status of the relationship. They're going to be more comfortable with providing higher levels of support, whether it's military, diplomatic, or financial as necessary. They're going to be more comfortable with having a closer relationship because it's clearly one that's mutually beneficial. It's not one that is being essentially sponsored by one country on behalf of another, which is their perception of the relationship as it stands. So this isn't just a potential solution on the left of the political divide. I do think it can have an impact on the right, although that may have to wait for changes in political leadership in the Republican Party itself.
Yeah, and I'll just tell you one thing on this political dynamic, and it can shift us to the last topic I want to talk about today too. But I do remember the way Israel has become such a political pinata in U.S. politics. I remember actually having breakfast with a senior Israeli diplomat couple months before Bibi came to Congress and gave a speech and went against Obama and Iran. And this diplomat said to me, there is no way the prime minister of Israel is going to directly confront the president of the United States on an issue like inside of the American domestic politics. And like 2 months later, that's exactly what we got. And we see where it's led 10 years later. And leading to the last issue of what I want to talk about, like this is, we are the wonks. We're not necessarily the hacks, unfortunately, today. But, we pay enough attention to politics to have watched what just happened in New Jersey. Tom Malinowski, Jeremy wrote about this over the weekend, conceded yesterday. Tom is somebody who, Andrew, I don't know if you worked with him. I certainly worked with him. A lot of us foreign policy nerds, the wonks did work with him. Tom is, I think, genuinely a foreign policy wonk by background. And in his race in New Jersey 11th district, very close, not where I grew up, but like right in the district next door to where I grew up. Basically AIPAC dropped $2.3 million into a primary to go against Tom. And what they did was, with these very deceptive ads that they're not anything about Israel, right? Just accusing him of supporting ICE with some pretty deceptive advertising, and ultimately resulted in a much further left-leaning candidate, Analia Mejia, winning the primary, someone who's completely unaligned with probably in terms of AIPAC's position, a much worse outcome for AIPAC than Tom Malinowski, who's kind of just a mainstream Democrat taking positions not all that dissimilar than ours, but sometimes when he was previously in Congress, not 100% aligned with J Street, and if anything, more supportive of some of the
Yes.
U.S.-Israel relationship. So just kind of a wild, and really just an example of Israel becoming a toxic, messy issue inside the Democratic Party and inside U.S. politics in ways that are incredibly unhealthy. And of course, an incredibly, it's just unhelpful role from AIPAC in this case. Really inexplicable almost given the outcome. But Andrew, interested in your take on what we've seen.
Well, I mean, I feel terrible for Tom. I've known him for many years, and I think he has the highest integrity. And I think you're right in terms of his positions on Israel, where he, in some respects he's closer to AIPAC than to J Street, and I would differ with him on those issues, but I have the highest confidence in him as a public servant in his commitment to the country, and I know personally that as someone who he was someone born in communist Poland who fled with his mom from that oppressive regime, came to the United States. He was someone who was always willing to speak out against Poland's complicated history with the Holocaust and their unwillingness at times to acknowledge their own responsibility for deaths and for parts of the Holocaust. Tom was willing to do that, and he proved himself to be a friend of the Jewish people. He proved himself to be a friend of any people, and he, as Assistant Secretary for DRL, for Human Rights, Democracy, and Labor at the State Department, he was someone who would speak, was willing to challenge any dictator. He was willing to go to a country to get kicked out if it was to advocate on the rights of an individual. And it didn't matter whether he agreed with that person. He, really represented the best of the best of the human rights community within the United States. So it's very, very disappointing in that sense. But it does show that AIPAC, which cultivates this this perception of invincibility, is not. They do miss. They do make a mistake, and there are now these efforts to say they're playing three-dimensional chess, and they deliberately wanted to get the progressive candidate to give a better shot to the Republicans. I don't particularly believe that. I think they were trying to advantage to get the perfect Democratic candidate, knowing that it's a very Democratic district, and that unlike Tom's earlier congressional district, which was a genuine swing district, the Democrats almost certainly going to win in this instance. But it is. I mean, it's ethically problematic as well because of what you said. Not only is there this question of money, and AIPAC isn't alone in this issue. There's dark money being used by any number of organizations, any number of individuals that is corrupting American politics, and that is something that is going to further corrode, further undermine our democracy at a time when it's under severe threat. There's also this disingenuous usage of issues that AIPAC does not have a position on. I mean, it would be what actually if J Street took a position on a candidate based on ICE, that would be more legitimate because J Street has come out and has criticized the abuses of ICE agents. AIPAC has been silent on it. In fact, AIPAC has been perfectly happy to endorse any number of candidates who have been amongst the most aggressive defenders of immigration raids, of draconian tactics against immigrants. So it's this not just hypocritical, but this almost Machiavellian approach where the ends justify the means. Are willing to engage in any type of behavior to try to get their objective, which is really problematic. And they have every right to advocate for whatever policy outcome they want, but I think they really have to ask themselves, is it worth it using these tactics? And beyond that, are they actually getting what they want? And what is their objective? Is it to support Israel, or is it to support Benjamin Netanyahu? And they're not the same thing. They certainly aren't the same thing now. And I would certainly argue that to the extent that Tom has been critical of Benjamin Netanyahu, he has not been critical of Israel. In fact, he probably should have been more critical of Israeli actions than he could have been. The fact that he hasn't just shows the degree to which AIPAC has established a standard that is not reflective of support for Israel. It's become a stalking horse for the Israeli government that's in power rather than for the country. And I don't think that serves the country particularly well. I don't think it serves Israel well. I don't think it serves the United States well. I don't think it serves anyone to have an organization that's operating in that fashion. You're never going to agree with any government 100% of the time, whether yours or another. And that's why when you have J Street or another organization that is supportive of the security of a foreign country, but at the same time is willing to call out actions that are counterproductive to that, that's a much more authentic and sincere way of supporting them, in my mind, than of just giving them blanket support. I mean, I just have a fundamentally different model of friendship and support in my mind. There are times where you just have to say, no, I'm not going to help you go down that route. I know where it ends. Fighting with your friend when you know it's going to be alongside your friend when you know it's going to be to both of your ruin. That may be attractive in a movie or in a novel, but in the real world, that just ends in ruin for everyone.
Yeah, I mean, look, AIPAC has traditionally, if you go back to the history of it, been an organization whose role has been to build bipartisan support for the U.S.-Israel relationship. And that's an objective I can support, but with limits that are healthy and protect our interests and are consistent with Jewish values. And I just don't understand how taking a bunch of really money from Republican donors and dropping them into the middle of a Democratic primary to go after a mainstream Democrat and a foreign policy expert and accuse them of supporting ICE, how does that build bipartisan support for the U.S.-Israel relationship? All it's really doing is just playing dirty politics and causing chaos inside a Democratic primary with really no objective and with an end result that I actually think is worse for AIPAC and worse for, the country as a whole. And look, I also, just to say, Andrew, very much agree with you. I don't think this was some three-dimensional chess. I think they just kind of banked on the fact that this is a pretty moderate district. It's Democratic leaning for sure. But Mejia couldn't get elected in this district, I think was their assumption. And so they were hoping to take down Malinowski so they could get one of the other candidates who then they could claim was victory and kind of do a bit of a warning shot to all the other candidates. Because Tom did come out and say he was willing to put some conditionality on support for Israel, which is just a reasonable thing that we should all be looking at. And is very much the mainstream Democratic position. And now here we are. And so,
I
you know,
it's not APAC alone. There are many organizations, many politicians who engage in these types of tactics, but that doesn't detract from how destructive they are. The crisis in our democracy in part stems from this cynicism and this belief that everyone is corrupt, everyone is everyone is self-serving, and this type of behavior where you're instrumentally exploiting an issue you don't care about as an organization and misrepresenting a politician's position on it in order to achieve some other objective. That's just going to sour younger generations on politics. And the strength of democracy stems from popular participation. And there really is, I think, a deep threat that the youngest generations, Generation Z, Generation Alpha, are tuned out. And if we don't stop those types of tactics, those types of behavior, whether you're sitting in Congress or you're involved in politics in some other way, even if we get through the next few years intact, it's not necessarily a great prognosis because we have to regain the trust of the American people, and these behaviors are completely antithetical to that objective.
Yeah, and I'll just say that at J Street, what we are trying to do, and our mentality, is not to try to instill fear and dump all this money, but instead to build relationships with members of Congress in the long term, to do that by engaging with them and helping them wrestle with these really complicated issues, and try to do it in a way that's reflective of their values and their politics and ours, and working with them in partnership. That's our mentality. And when it comes to how we try to support candidates in our elections, our major focus, we actually just announced a super PAC this week that we are supporting in the last couple of days, and folks can read about that. And our priority in this election cycle in 2026 is going to be defeating anti-democracy, MAGA candidates. We're going to support, because defending our democracy is the most important thing we need to do right now as Americans and as American Jews. We're going to support pro-Israel candidates, pro-peace candidates, and pro-democracy candidates. It's all the above, because that's what matters, and those are the values that not just us, but really the overwhelming majority of American Jews, if you look at voting patterns and you look at surveys, believe in. And so anyway, I think we're coming to the end here. Andrew, I want to thank you for taking time to be with us today. And great, like you said, it's always nice to just have old friends on the show and be able to talk about things, especially today. When we were planning on having you on, we weren't planning on having a Trump-Bibi meeting to talk about. So that also, makes it easier to have some very interesting conversations. And, we'll see where all this stuff in the next 24 hours go as the debriefs and the various journalists reporting come out.
It's the first time in history Trump is not seeking media coverage.
Yeah, I mean,
it might be a sign of the apocalypse.
It's either the sign of that, or there's some trouble in paradise between Bibi and Trump, or we're going to have like a strike in Iran over the next few days. I don't believe in that last one, but you never know. So
you can't exclude it. It is a possibility.
All right. Well, thank you, Andrew. Thanks to everybody for tuning in. We'll see all of you next week on Word on the Street. And again, just a reminder, we're getting really close to the convention. It's not too late to sign up and join us here. Thanks. Take care, everybody.
Thank you.